Hello, my name's Martin Hinchelwood, special Scrum trainer with Scrum.org. I want a little chat today about some of this information comes from some well-known sources. I'm going to elaborate on those sources. Started. Okay. So 80%, 81% of all development shops say they're agile. That's based on Forrester research. Of that 81%, around 80%, 82%, I think, are say that they're doing. However, the reality that almost 81% of them are lying. That's the thing that we find. Anybody out there who is a trainer, a coach, a scrum master will know that these things are almost never. So how can we tell the real thing from what might be considered? I do have some very concrete measures we can use. They are not mine. They come from another organization, which I will describe. I just found them interesting enough to build. Only 22% of organizations do short iterations. That's iterations of 6 weeks or less. Agile Manifesto does say that we should have iterations of 6 weeks or less, or get stuff in front of our customers 6 weeks or less. The Scrum Guide would say 30 days or less, one. But if you don't have short iterations, and that are the only ones that do, then the likelihood of you being and only 16% have an ordered backlog. This is one I do not understand. If an organization is going to spend money having a team of software engineers working through a body of work, why would you not want to make sure you're working on the most important? 16% have an ordered backlog. You'll probably find that they have something they would call a backlog at all. Only 13% do retrospectives. Closing that feedback loop is super important. How do we make sure that we don't do the same thing wrong all the time? Reflect on not just what we just did, but how we did it, and how to get better at that story. So this data that I'm using here comes from Forrester research. I have a slide with the original data for that. I found it pretty interesting. Feel free to have a shift to yourself, because really the reality today with organizations is that while it looks like they're doing the right thing, big secret is we're all a mess inside. I don't know any service orientated organization. I'm thinking of a bank where I've heard of a consultant developer going in and really liking what they do. Behind the scenes, things tend to be a little bit bit interesting. Let me check if I can do something about the sound. So I'm not sure if I managed to actually fix the sound or do something about it. Hopefully I'll find out soon. One comment on why it's so hard to change. It's a cultural thing. We like to, as humans, we like to do really the same thing. We get stuck in our way of doing something, and unless we feel that we're empowered to make changes through that process, then it's very, very difficult. I just Googled why is change so hard and Dilbert, and I had a plethora of choices for what constitutes like. So there's something that we all know and love. This is the tyranny of Taylorism. I'm being very specific here. I'm trying to avoid the term waterfall for very specific reasons. I'll talk about them as I go through. But ultimately, you'll see this process reflected in many organizations, requirements through to design, through to implementation, verification, and maintenance. You might even see in organizations that they have a HR department, they have a sales department, they have a IT department, they have an operations department as completely separate entities. And there's a very good reason why we ended up in that position. It's not necessarily good now, but for the time when those ideas came about, it was the right way to approach. But times have changed. We have more understanding of how humans interact with work. We have more understanding about the complexities of a lot of the work we do, and most people now do cognitive work. So let's have a look. Why do we work that way? So we need to kind of go back in time a little bit. Go back to pre-1890. Before 1890, people generally lived pretty close to where they work. Whenever they had a problem, they just rallied around and figured out how to solve it. So there's a lot of innovation. They tended to work very, very close to their family. And if you were doing a job, you did the whole job, not just part of the job. So you can see there the cobbler on the right, the apprentice learning how to make the shoe. The reality is that cobbler probably knew the person who they were making the shoe for. They knew what their job was, how they were going to use the shoe, that product. And the cobbler can make that shoe with that person in mind. They probably made that person's previous shoe, and they know that person can come back in whenever they've got a problem with the shoe, so they can get it sold. They'll know the experience that user that person has had with that work. And that's a very powerful way to build products that have a very high happiness ratio with others. But how do we scale that? It can be very difficult. So in just after the 1890s, the Industrial Revolution kicked off into full, and it was a time of lots of money was made, but you can see in those pictures that there are people doing very individual tasks. I would struggle to even understand what these folks were making. There's something round for sure, with bolts in it. It could be clocks, it could be parts for cars, it could be washing machines, it could be any sort of device. We don't really know. And it doesn't really matter for the individual sitting at their workstation. They only need to do the one thing. I usually use the example of Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. Charlie's dad had a job before he lost his job to a robot, and his job was screwing the top on toothpaste bottles. Like a very task. And when we do menial tasks, our brains disengage from the work. So that's the difference here, is that on the left we have the cobbler making the custom shoe for the individual person that they know, that they interact with. They understand the whole process. Whereas on the right we have the factory floor, where the individual users don't really even care, don't even need to know what the thing is that they're creating. They probably have some idea. It's probably difficult to work in a factory and not know what the output is. But do they really understand how their piece of the puzzle contributes to the overall thing? They're just doing exactly what they're told. So there were two really big thought leaders at the time. The first was a gentleman called Frederick Winston Taylor. And he has a comment that I think you'll find very in keeping with our understanding of how current management practices, like think of this as the foundation of current management practices. Hardly a competent worker can be found who does not devote a considerable amount of time to studying just how slowly they can work and still convince their employer that they are the case. If you think about that position of distrust that people are trying not to work, that's a very common mental practice for management, for project managers, for the way people manage other people in the world today. There are, I'm not saying that's everybody, there are lots of progressive people out there, but that is a very common mindset that's starting to change, but it's changing very slowly. Taylor invented something called the scientific management method, and it was based on the knowledge at the time. So what they did was they developed standard methods for performing each job, best practices. They divided workers into appropriate ability-based groups for each job. So you know, they're going to have the steel workers, the for want of a better expression, the project managers, the coders, the testers, the operations, having them all as separate ability-based groups. They understand that, so they should all work together on that one task. You saw in the pictures of the factory floor, they have everybody that does that one task together so they can deliver those standards. They train the workers in those standard methods because there's no thought. We need to remove thinking, and we're just going to plan their work so they do it the way we tell them to do it. And we're going to create a bunch of wage incentives to. You'll see some of these things in maybe the current management practices of your organization. Hopefully you work in a more progressive organization. But Taylor had somebody who came after him, kind of a disciple, somebody who looked up to his work. And that was a gentleman called Henry Gantt. And Henry Gantt came up with some things we know and love today, apart from the Gantt chart, but he created the task and bonus system of wage payment. He created a basic wage based on expected low performance. So if we think from a position of distrust of our employees, they're going to try and work less. So let's pay them like we expect them to work. So pay them less for their work, and then we'll give them bonuses if they manage to meet the expected proficiency. That way, we incentivize by default. And also, if we're going to have all of these folk that need told what to do because we're removing thinking, then we need managers to manage them. Depending on the complexity of the work, you might need more managers, and you might need managers to manage the managers. But the managers should be motivated based on getting bonuses on the outcomes of their staff. So if you think of, well, I worked in Merrill Lynch, I had to fill out a bunch of status reports at the end of each week, which I would give to my dev lead, who collected them together for all of their direct reports and passed it on up the chain. Everybody had a head count, they were accountable for that head count and the amount of work that was delivered. They also, Henry Gantt came up with this thing, it's a noun I like to call the modern school system. You might hear folks refer to the modern school system even today. And when they refer to it, they're referring to this, something a little bit like this picture here. That was like my class in school, although this was a lot further ago. But everybody in a modern school, everybody sits in rows. People do the same thing at the same time. There's no talking. You got to put your hand up, and incentive-based learning and reward for fulfilled tasks. These are techniques designed to create factory workers. The modern school system was designed to do that. It was designed to remove thinking, just do what you're told, just follow the set of tasks you've been given. It doesn't matter if you don't understand it. So many of us grew up in this system. Many of our kids are in more of a hybrid system where teachers are trying to push away from this idea of roles. But they're struggling against a system like we are that defaults to the old way. You go to there's places in the Netherlands where they have changed the school system to be more in keeping with what we expect from people. Group exercises, learning together, presenting the stuff that happens in the modern workplace. So really, there's no difference between the modern school system and that scientific management, industrial revolution and the factory floor. These two folks optimize for output and not outcome. If you're a coach or a trainer, following this, you'll know this already. But I find that knowing why something is a certain way help us combat some of the ideas. And in 1908, this was the first Harvard Business School. I think this might be the graduating class of Harvard Business School. And loads of the leaders of the time, the people who would be managers at the time or who are going to be managers at the time, flocked to these schools doing MBAs. So this was the first MBA. And we know those ideas have lasted for a long time. In the 50s, this new way of working started to emerge and become more prevalent across the board, not just as part of the production line process. So dividing people into specialist skills, marketing, sales, contracts, development, testing, all of them are separate things. And then create things sequentially and hand things between the different sections. That doesn't take into account the complexity of the work. Then round about the 1950s, the US military complex, who is, I think, still the largest buyer in the world. They have a lot of employees, a lot of people that work with them, a lot of consultants, and because they were such a large buyer, their power to push vendors and consulting companies towards this model that they wanted to use was immense. Most people couldn't escape it, and if you work with any large consulting company, they probably work with the Department of Defense, especially at the time. And if you work with the Department of Defense, you must do this new staged process. So they adopt it, and eventually it just becomes part of their procurement processes. Yeah, so the procurement processes that we know and love, that I struggle with when I'm working with customers. I even had an engagement with a customer, because it was I think it was I can't remember the big consulting company I was working with. I was doing a short engagement, like a day's worth of work, and they couldn't figure out how to pay me their procurement processes. So they basically handed me a stack of cash because they just couldn't figure out it wasn't worth the effort of going through the procurement process. I didn't get a training engagement at Royal Bank of Scotland in Edinburgh because they couldn't get the procurement process done in time. It was just not possible. That seems to be the way things are in a lot of our large organizations with a lot of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy comes with these different departments and separating people into that work. So if we fast forward again to the current modern times, this stuff was applied to software development, and it didn't work out so well. Experiences that we love, but I've got an interesting article. So the largest organization in the world with the most employees in the world has realized they made a mistake. This particular organization has 2.8 million employees, largest employer, and a $739 billion budget. They are, in fact, the Department of Defense in the US, and they have realized that they've created this monster that is the sequential working process, and it's gone through all companies around the world. So in 2010, they brought in a bunch of Agile folks. So I believe Jeff Sutherland was there, Kent Beck was there, a few other folks. I don't know everybody that was involved. And they got together to rewrite how can we change our procurement rules to take advantage of these new thinking and new ways of thinking. So they pulled it all together, and the new procurement rules, which mandated short iterative cycles of delivered value to the customer, which is the Department of Defense, went live in 2013. But as you can imagine, now that the procurement rules have been changed, Agile then becomes a buzzword of software development, and therefore all projects now declare themselves to be Agile. So the Department of Defense created this document called Detecting Agile BS, that is for their procurement officers to really understand what it is they're looking for in a vendor. When a vendor says they're Agile, how do you know they're telling the truth? How do you know? So I have here some questions for you. This is a small number of questions, and I usually do this in a large auditorium. So I usually get everybody to stand up, And I'm going to ask 6 questions. And after each question, if your answer is no, then you should sit down. Obviously, you do it metaphorically. So the first question: are teams delivering working software to at least some subset of real users every iteration, including the first, and gathering feedback? I'm going to clarify real users. Real users does not mean UAT. Real users does not mean a test. Real users means people using your software in a production environment. That's what real users means in this. If you aren't doing that, then you're not agile, and that's step 1. Are you doing this? Getting real feedback. Otherwise, there's no agility there. Second question: is there a product charter that lays out the strategic goals of your project, and do all members of the team understand what they are and how the work they do contributes? If not, then you're not doing agile. I would recommend a book called Turn This Ship Around by David Marquette. It talks about pushing responsibility down the organization, helping everybody understand what the goals and objectives are so that they can make better decisions. Stop telling people what to do. That's this. Next one: are teams empowered to change their process based on what they learn? Can they change their iteration pace? Can they change how they do their reviews, retrospectives? Can they choose to do Scrum? Can they choose to do Kanban? Can they choose to do something else? All of those things need to be true. Otherwise, agile again. We've got 3 more questions. That was number 3. Is feedback from users turned into concrete work items for sprint teams on timelines shorter than a month? We need to get feedback from those users that in the first one we delivered our real software to. And we get feedback from them and we update the product backlog. We bring that information our planning of the future on timescales shorter than 1 month. If not, then unfortunately we're still not doing agile. Are teams empowered to change requirements based on user feedback? This can be a real problem in bureaucratic organizations that have a separation or still have a separation between contracts, sales, and engineering. There shouldn't be that separation to this type of thing. You have a concrete thing signed off by somebody who doesn't really understand the interest actually building stuff. You go to build stuff, you get it in front of users. User needs a change, wants something different. What you're working on is not quite right. We need to be able to make those changes. If not, then yep, you guessed it, we're not doing agile. And the last one I think is, or is that the second? Is the full ecosystem of your project agile? Agile programming teams followed by linear bureaucratic deployments failure. Ultimately, there should be no human interaction between a developer committing a line of code and it getting into production. If you're going to have human interaction, it should be limited to the clicking of an approval button or some kind of sign-off process. It should not be any scripts, any deployments, any creating servers, setting up that. None of those things should. And if you can't say yes to all of those questions, then you're probably not yet crossed that line into the world. And those are hard lines to cross. This example is from the Department of Defense in the US. They apply this now for both hardware and software. So if you're building a new guided missile for the Department of Defense, all of these things need to be true in order for you win that procurement. And I think that's hard. I don't think they're definitely not there yet. That's why they're doing this article, in order to encourage people to move a little bit faster and do those things. But ultimately, by improving our processes and practices, by getting quicker at delivering, by using those feedback loops, large projects can get up to 600% more success, more likely to be successful. That number's smaller for small projects because the risk is less. They're usually closer to the customer. It's easier to have a discussion and change what you're doing in a small project. But in large projects, that can be incredibly difficult. There's a lot of legacy code, a lot of legacy ideas, legacy procedures and practices, and that can be difficult. Now, I would encourage you to look at other folks' processes and see the way they do it. I like the largest company I know of to have actually made a successful agile transformation or agile evolution, or start their agile evolution, is Microsoft. They've made a lot of changes in the last 8 years. They've moved to continuous delivery and are doing all of those things. But don't just look at somebody else's process and try and rubber stamp it onto your own. There are many practices out there. There's SAFe, there's the Spotify model. I always find the Spotify model amusing because of the article was a point in time. Like, don't do this. Here's what we're doing now. The Spotify is not doing what it describes in that article anymore. They've moved on from there. These are maybe a starting point, a place to glean some ideas, but make sure you have the ability to dynamically create and manage your process. And I'll leave you with a lovely memo or a statement from the US Air Force. This is a clarifying statement about a memo. And it says, if you read the top underlined, highly discouraged from using rigid prescriptive frameworks such as scaled agile framework, SAFe framework, in an effort to move towards DevOps or DevSecOps, whatever you want to call it, DevOps and agility. Things like SAFe and any prescriptive model is potentially harmful to your ability to innovate, potentially harmful to your ability to change. It's not used by successful software commercial organizations. That should be an indication. Because I would say that the art of simplicity is a puzzle of complexity. We have to try and make things as simple as possible. Do that over time. Well, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the stream. I'm hoping the sound problem was a little limited to a particular time frame. If not, I will have to look at how I manage that